I didn't have my notes ready. Okay. I have to read off my notes, otherwise, who knows what I'll say. Okay. I'm Steph Schmidt. I'm the manager at Water Street Bookstore, and I'm on the LitFest board. We're joined today by authors Jacquelyn Benson and Alex Myers, who have both written novels with fantasy elements, and we're going to talk about their books and their writing experiences. So let me start by introducing them. Alex Myers is a writer, teacher, and speaker. He was the first transgender student in Phillips Exeter Academy's history and the first openly trans student at Harvard. Alex is an active transgender advocate and speaker. He's also the author of the novels Revolutionary, Continental Divide, The Story of Silence, and The Symmetry of Stars, and the nonfiction guide supporting transgender students. And Jackie, I'm going to read your cute bio that is on your website. So
that's fine.
Just imagine this in her voice. Jacquelyn Benson writes smart historical fantasy where strong women confront the stranger things that occupy the borders of our world. She once lived in a museum, wrote a master's thesis on the cultural anthropology of paranormal investigation, and received a gold medal for being clever. She owes a great deal to her elementary school librarian for sagely choosing to acquire the entire Time-Life Mysteries of the Unknown series. Her debut novel, The Smoke Hunter, was nominated for Best Historical Fiction by RT Times. And when not writing, she enjoys the company of a tall, dark, and handsome English teacher and practices unintentional magic. And why don't we start by having you guys both talk about your fantasy books, just kind of give a little overview of what they're like.
What they are. So
yeah.
I can jump in. I write gas lamp fantasy, which means fantasy that is set in either an actual sort of Victorian or Edwardian time period and setting, or a fictional world that feels like it's that kind of Victorian setting. My stuff is set literally in the UK and other parts of the world in the late 19th century and early 20th century. The series that I'm working on right now, which is called The London Charismatics, is they're mystery novels with supernatural elements woven into the stories and a lot of action and high stakes danger. So they're very action-packed mystery novels.
Great. So I have written 2 fantasy novels that are both based on historical manuscripts. So it's been a process of recovering a story from the past, expanding, retelling, revising, sometimes adding some magic, sometimes taking some magic away, and kind of mixing and melding history and fantasy.
And how did you guys both come to the genre of fantasy? Was that through sort of your own reading and your own enjoyment of it, or some other way?
I mean, for me, because the stuff I write is what we call low fantasy, so it's set in our own world where we add magical elements into our own history, and I try to tie as much real stuff into the stories as I can. I've always been fascinated, as my bio kind of said, by the stories people tell, both in the present and the past, that make the borders of what we consider real a little wider than they might otherwise be. I like to think that the world is a stranger and more interesting place than we give it credit for, and that's what I want to reflect in the stories that I tell. So for me, it really isn't any other genre. I'm always going to find some weird stuff to work into my stories.
I'm a lifelong reader of fantasy and science fiction. In fact, I'm teaching an elective in that right now this spring, and I love it. I like how it makes things possible that feel impossible in life, and I particularly feel that's true around gender. A lot of hierarchies that exist that feel imposed upon us or structural and indestructible. Magic can, subvert the patriarchy, and that's great. So that's part of what I like. I also have always enjoyed history, and there was a wonderful time when magic was real. That the division we make now between what's fantasy and what's real really didn't exist. And so particularly my first fantasy novel, The Story of Silence, is just set in a period when magic was there. It wasn't really questioned or thought to be fantastical. So I find that interesting too.
Well, and I studied anthropology in school, right? And if you get outside of sort of Western culture, there's so much more room for the magical and the strange, what we would consider the strange in other cultures in the world too. So we have this very narrow way of looking at how we frame reality. And a lot of other places in the world, it is a lot bigger and broader and stranger than that.
Something I'm always fascinated by in fantasy is the world building. So how much time did you both spend creating your worlds before you started writing, or did the world building kind of come along with the story? And Jackie, of course, yours is a lot of historic, your setting is in historic London, but how much time did you spend sort of mapping it all out before you started?
Do you mean like literally studying ordnance survey maps? Because I did spend a lot of time doing that.
I mean, it's so detailed, like you can really picture it. Did you go?
I have been to London. I've been a couple times, but I haven't spent nearly as much time in that city as in reality as I have in my head. So yeah, there's a ton of, in terms of the physical world building, of just a lot of learning that you have to do if you're setting your story in an actual place. To me, it's important that it feels as authentic and detailed as possible. So I'm not happy to just kind of fudge things. I want to know if there actually was a chip shop on that corner in like 1898, which you often can't find. And then I have to remember that it's okay to make things up as well.
Yeah, I'm the person who makes things up and doesn't check it. Close tape. Okay, so I enjoy the fantasy in a broad sense, like that country may or may not exist, sort of fantasy. And the atmosphere of it. And I think in the Story of Silence, the original manuscript is definitely set in Cornwall. I've never been to Cornwall. Did look at some pictures. And the person who wrote this Silence, the original poem, was French, and clearly had never been to England. So I got to kind of capitalize on that in terms of a complete misconstruing of geography and time and place. And it was kind of fun to just make that part of the fantasy element. But generally, I love research, and in writing both historical fiction and historical fantasy, I think for me, my issue is, when do I stop doing research and start doing writing?
Yeah, tell me about it. Yeah, it's terrible. I have to like set a timer and peel myself away from Google.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Alex, your latest book has a lot of knights and knight fighting. What is that called? Dueling?
Sure,
yeah,
dueling sounds good.
War?
Yeah.
Yep.
So tell us about the research for that.
I've been to some Renaissance fairs, and that about covers it. I really believe that...
It felt very real, so you nailed it.
And who would you ask if you doubted it, right? I mean, who's going to be like, actually, I was, in my armor the other day, and there's probably somebody. But I did look things up in terms of making sure that the weapons I was placing together were not anachronistic. And then it was just imagination. And I think that's, bar none, what I enjoy about writing fiction, is just going where my imagination takes me and not having to be beholden to reality. I mean, I don't break the laws of gravity, but I don't get too tied up about details. That has come back to bite me, but I usually enjoy it. So.
Alex, do you want to talk a little bit about the legend that inspired your latest book?
Sure.
It wasn't one that I was familiar with, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there were two very long, somewhat tedious poems in the Orlando cycle. And the first one people tend to know a little bit better because it was rewritten by Virginia Woolf into the book Orlando. And then the second half was commissioned, maybe 50 years after the original, maybe 100 years after the original, and written in Italian. And it's extraordinary long and really difficult to follow the plot of, and it's got a bunch of different plot threads, and one of those plot threads follows a set of twins, and it's magical and bizarre, and one of the twins is a girl who fights in armor, but everyone knows she's a woman warrior. And so she kind of fascinated me in this sort of, how does she get away with that? And there's no explanation given in the poem. She just does it, and there's a magician named Melissa who kind of interferes with them, and there's absolutely zero explanation for how these characters got away with it. And the poem is mostly interested in other characters. So I was fascinated by the project of pulling their storyline out of the original poem and just saying, like, who are these people and how do they get to do what they do? So that was an entertaining project.
And Jackie, in your books, I got kind of a Sherlock Holmes feel. Is that something that you...
Oh, yeah, 100%. Yeah. No, I have no shame about being derivative of lots of... I mean, I write that genre because I love reading those sort of late 19th century Sherlock Holmes and Dracula and Jekyll and Hyde and all of, I mean, the genre is just so fun. And even like the really bad stuff too. Like if you've read some of Bram Stoker's other works, you're just like, God, we're really just slogging on through here. When's this mummy gonna start tearing people up, you know? But it's, yeah, so you write what you love. You write the stuff that hooks you, and that atmosphere that just like, it's still industrial, but it's not yet modern. It's right on the cusp of becoming the world that we would recognize more as our own. To me, that's just a really rich time period to mine in, you know? And I like being able to reference all that other stuff in the book, whether I'm doing it directly or indirectly, so.
And then there's some romance.
Of course there's romance. Romance is what gives you a chance to put your characters through like the ultimate emotional ringer to me. So, I mean, and everyone has differing opinions on that, but to me it's the stakes for delving into your own shadow and your own baggage become really rich and really real when you put two characters together in that romantic context. But then you want to draw it out too. I don't want to make it too easy for them, so we have to try to make it really complicated.
And you have 3 books so far in your
There's 3 books and a novella out in the series. I'm writing the 4th and last one now.
Oh, nice.
Yes.
Awesome. So I found both of your stories had these great, powerful messages about gender and identity and finding a place in the world. Was that something that you kind of came into it hoping to impart, or did that come along with the story in your writing?
Well, I know for me, definitely, the heroine of the books, the series that we're talking about in my story, she's a bastard. She was born out of wedlock. Her father is a nobleman. Her mother was an Irish actress. And to me, I wanted to write a story about somebody who didn't fit into what at that time was a really rigid hierarchy of the upper classes and everybody else. Someone who didn't have a firm place in that world and who had to try to figure out how to navigate it and in essence, you know, build her own world and her own family as a result of that. So yeah, definitely a deliberate choice. That, again, just felt like really rich territory for a compelling character and good storytelling, so.
Likewise, I was drawn to the original story because it was a woman who did unexpected things, and the question I always have is, how do they get away with it, right? Particularly when they're based on a true person, but even when they aren't. And then my second question is, why were readers back then fascinated by that? So there's a lot of tales of women who are masquerading as knights, and why is that a sort of theme in literature? What are we looking for in the ideal woman, that we would sometimes champion that? So that was definitely one of the questions that led me to want to write the novel.
And let's talk a little bit about both of you with your writing process. In our first panel, they talked about outlining versus writing by the seat of your pants. Mm-hmm. Do you guys have thoughts on that?
Yeah. Yeah, I know, and every author has to find their own path with this. I actually have a theory that when people talk about writer's block, what they're really talking about is a part of their own process they haven't yet discovered, right? That writer's block happens when you haven't figured out how, what your tools are that you personally as a writer need to use to find your way through a narrative. So the first 2 books I wrote by the seat of my pants, and it was hell. And then I realized that I'm a inveterate outliner, and my outlines are elaborate and layered, and they start out broad and they get narrower and narrower and narrower, and it's probably 6 or 7 passes through that before I get to the point where I'm going to actually write the sentences that you'll see in the book. And I have friends who are like, that sounds incredibly annoying.
I would say that I have never used the same process twice in composing a novel. My first novel, I think I was fortunate. It was historical fiction, and so there was a real lived life of a person, and that gave me an outline functionally. It was sort of a skeleton with a lot to add to it. In my second novel, I used Robert Olin Butler's technique, and he suggests that as you're thinking of an idea you want to write on, that every time a scene occurs to you, you write it on an index card, and on the front you kind of sketch out the basics of where the scene is and who's in it, and the other side is what you want the scene to sort of achieve within the work. And when you've got enough index cards, you can kind of put them together into an outline. And I found that really helpful because I kept thinking about it but not being able to put it together. But since then, I've never used that technique again. And so my last two novels are much more by the seat of my pants. But again, working from a historical text is for me useful because it gives me the structure of this is what I have to do to be true to the history. Although it always leaves me plenty of room to fill in around that.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Anyone want to jump in? That's fine if not.
Well, and in a way, just to kind of play on that, right? So you talk about these existing structures that you get from a manuscript. In a lot of other genres, not fantasy, there are these really nice rigid structures that you can borrow from when you're constructing a story. You know, in romance, like there are rules about how these stories play out. And I feel like one of the challenges and also the more intriguing things about writing in the fantasy genre is like we have tropes, but we don't have these really firmly established story structures. I feel like it's a little more the Wild West out there in terms of what shape your story eventually is going to take, which as an author is definitely both a blessing and a curse, because having that template there in front of you, whether it's basing the material on something else that you're kind of riffing off of, or whether you're trying to emulate like a favorite type of story, it gives you someplace to start from. Those blank pages and that complete openness of possibility is one of the most intimidating things you can face, I think, as a writer.
Especially with fantasy and sci-fi, where you don't even necessarily have the rules of the world. And
right. Yeah. You can't even trust reality to help you structure your storytelling. You really have to go out there and create your own boundaries and your own sense of where the borders of your world are going to be and what it is that your story needs to focus on.
You guys both did some interesting things with time in your books. Alex, I loved having, if you read The Symmetry of Stars, you'll see one of the characters goes to visit the other characters, and the way you have her sort of be able to like fast forward and rewind, I thought that was really clever, and it allows you to sort of tell this story without having to maneuver too much. I thought it was really clever, but how did you come up with that?
Thanks. I'm glad you thought it was clever. I wanted her to be able to spy on her twin. So these are two celestial beings, kind of godlings, and I needed her to be able to move through time and space and slow down and speed up. Otherwise, the plot was going to become utterly unwieldy, and to go back and forth between these two settings and to make time run at the same pace in both would have made a very long novel and a very boring novel. So I just wanted to come up with something that seemed magical but not too bizarre. And so the thought that somebody could just accelerate time or just slip through a little hole and get back to the past appealed to me as a useful bit of magic to have.
Well, and I think it worked really well in the story too, because you were able to like really choose the moments you were going to delve into. And I mean, some stories that mess around with chronology like that can become hard to follow, but because you had that premise of how this was taking place, like it gave you something to sort of hang your hat on as a reader in order to follow that narrative through, even when you were jumping around a bit in time.
And Jackie, in your book, and I've just read the first one in the series, but there's characters that can see the future and there's characters that see the past, and then that allows you to have these sort of great moments without doing, I guess, flashbacks or backstory or...
Right. I mean, there are occasionally flashbacks in the storyline, but the whole, the core of the story for me was the idea of what it would actually be like to see the future, and what if you can see the future, but you can't actually change anything about what you foresee, or how much could you change? Like, what does it even, what does the future even mean when you start talking about people with supernatural powers? One of the things that always drives me crazy is when they just gloss over what the emotional consequences of that would be. It's so much more interesting to think about, like, what would make this hard for somebody and how would they have to then overcome that? But in terms of structuring story, having a character who sees the future forces you to plan ahead, and then inevitably your plans get completely jacked up, and then you have to try to figure out how to still tell the story that is now pulling you off in this other direction where you need to go, and yet still fulfill all of the prophecies that you dropped back in the earlier books, and make sure that it all comes together. But sometimes I think that setting puzzles for yourself like that as a writer can actually drive you to be more creative with the stuff that you come up with for your story and where it's going to go. So
I also liked in yours the people saw the future, but they didn't see it crystal clear. And so there were a lot of symbols that could be interpreted one way or another, and it left some ambiguity, but it also struck me as accurate to how prophecy or fortune telling would work, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I kind of geeked out with, I don't know anyone who can see the future. I'll just let y'all know that. But I do know people who speak to the dead, and I've talked to them extensively about what that experience is like, and they talk about it. These aren't literal conversations. It's something that happens through, feeling and instinct and symbol and dream, and all of that kind of wrapped together in like another language that we don't typically learn to speak very fluently. So, I figured that I would make her power have some kind of a similar feel to that.
And like a less weighty note, the dresses are so beautiful.
Aren't they?
Yeah.
It's so
and
fun.
I could picture all of them. The details are so gorgeous.
That's because I go on Pinterest and I search the
tell me
hell
about
out of that. Oh yeah, the boards. Oh, it's so fun. Yes, yeah, the outfits. I mean, the part, if you're going to write historical fiction, you're going to write it because you're a nerd for like suits of armor or really nice corsets.
Yes, well, I could definitely picture it all, and I could see your board that you probably have with like.
There's a board. There's definitely a board.
That's great. Oh, we have a mic.
You've touched on the question I was going to ask. When you're writing a fantasy, do you think through ahead of time the parameters of what kind of superpowers they're going to have? And when I read fantasy, I think, well, they could have any superpower you want them to have, but you don't want them to be God. So
exactly. Yeah. No, you absolutely need rules. The rules are what make fantasy interesting as a storyline. Like if you've ever tried to, play a role-playing game with somebody who just like ignores the point system and just tries to win at everything, it's no fun, right? You need to have a sense of the limitations of these superpowers, because that's where the interesting part of the fantasy storytelling happens, is as much about what they can't do as it is about what they can.
And what they can do, but they will not. I also find really interesting sort of the ethics of magic, and to have somebody who says, I could do that, but it would really screw things up, and here's why magic shouldn't intervene in that case. So I find it, if you have an all-powerful or nearly all-powerful, or compared to humans, all-powerful entity, if they have no moral or ethical guideposts, world's in trouble. And so what's going to steer them to say, I can read your future, but I'm not going to disclose that to you. So I like that, as well as limitations on the powers themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
don't you guys talk about what you have coming up next? Alex, you've written in so many different, you've got nonfiction, you've got historical fiction, you've done so many different things. What could you do next? How about?
Yeah, my agent hates me. She's like, pick something and settle down so I can sell the next one. But I just got back from her. I wrote a prep school-based murder mystery. So not historical fiction. Definitely not fantasy and sci-fi, but certainly based
Completely new thing.
Completely new. She's like, thanks a lot. It was a hell of a lot of fun to write. I mean, I teach at a prep school. I did not murder any of my colleagues. It was not catharsis. But yeah, so that's what I'm cooking now.
That's delightful.
And I'm working on the fourth and final novel in the series. So we're now in the middle of World War I, which just so many. I know this is going to sound strange, but it's like so much fun. The research that I get to do and geek out with is so rich. There's just like, it's like just this utterly fascinating and terrible period of history, and I'm having a ball.
And are you going to go back to your first book and write more on that? Because your first book was sort of a female Indiana Jones. And it was so fun. So I would say you could.
Are you requesting?
Yeah.
Yes, you're requesting some more. Yes, I do have more stories in that series. And now there was, sort of publishing logistics stuff that was holding me up. But I now have the rights back for that book. And I can go ahead and tell more swashbuckling feminist historical adventure stories for y'all. So.
Yeah, you both have pretty different publishing journeys. Do you want to talk at all about that a little bit?
I don't mind. Yeah. So for me, my first book was published by one of the big New York publishing houses, and they were lovely humans. But what often happens, I think, if you're a new author and you don't have an established following, you don't have a lot of control over how the book is positioned, like what genre they kind of place it in, how they market it, where it goes in the world. And that experience ended up kind of just hitting a wall for me. So I, with my second book, decided to go it alone and put the book out myself. And it's a lot to take on, but I'm very blessed in that I have this wonderful network of other writers in my genre who are just the indie writer community is amazing. They're so supportive. It's not competitive. It's all about lifting each other up. It's a really amazing and inspiring place to be right now. And there's so much possibility happening and a lot of new ideas and new ways of getting your books out there that are kind of happening. So I've now moved into publishing my own work, and it helps too because I'm a picky control freak, and that way I can dictate, with a lot of intelligent input from other smart people, I can ultimately make the decisions about what my books look like when they get into the world and how I try to make sure that they actually find their audience, because that's hard. You can write this wonderful story, but if it's not framed just right, and sometimes it takes trial and error to figure out what that is, right? If you're not writing in a really kind of clear, well-established, I write vampire romance novels, and this is exactly what I need to do to my books to put them out there. If you're not in that zone, it can take some messing around to figure out the right language and the right visual language to put your books out there and find your people. So.
True enough. Likewise, my first novel came out from Simon & Schuster, and sounds probably like a similar experience. Super nice people, and I was clueless and had no idea what was going on. And then after that book came out, kind of tried to sell the next one, which was very different from the first. And my agent shopped it around without much luck. And the answer that we kept getting back from editors and publishers was, this is a really great novel. We don't know who the audience would be, because it was a transgender coming of age story. And major houses are really, really reluctant to step into certain types of LGBTQ fiction. So eventually I went with a university press, University of New Orleans, and they brought it out. They did a lovely job. They bought a second book from me, and simultaneous to that, I had written, just kind of on a lark, this historical fantasy, The Story of Silence, and my agent was like, what the hell, we'll shop that around, and she sold that on a 2-book deal. So I had 4 books come out in 2 years.
Wow.
And 3 of the 4 came out in the pandemic, which is not the ideal time to have a book come out, let alone 3 books. books. So it's been an exciting COVID, and hopefully we'll be out of it with the next one. And I guess whether it's a big house or a small house, for me, what's made all the difference is who's doing the editing and how well I can work with them to make the writing good. And I don't have the marketing skills, patience, or abilities to do the self-publishing thing. You really have to be your own entrepreneur, and I am not. I'm more than happy to have someone else sell my book. So that has been great to rely on them to do that.
I mean, and I love writing, but I also am very happy with like a pivot table and a social media planner. So it works for me to do the entrepreneurial thing, but you're absolutely right. It is, you're running a business and on top of writing fiction, and it definitely makes it a little more complicated.
Is it on? Okay. I had a question, Jacquelyn. This might be more for you because you said you do have a series. Alex, I don't know if you have any series, but did you plan the whole series out? Were you, right when you wrote your first book, did you know it was going to be a series and you were going to have follow-on books? Or did you like drop hints in the first book that there's going to be more? Just how you planned a longer series?
Oh yeah, no, I planned the whole thing. I had it all planned out and it all went to hell. And then I had to, for all the great reasons, because when you're up, for me, again, as somebody who outlines my stories, right, that early, getting that sense of the scope of the whole series, you're going really high level and your sense of those stories is up here. And then when I actually start to get down to digging into what those scenes look like and what happens to the characters, I'd realize this isn't the right direction. I need to take them, this isn't the right story. And so all of the books since the first one ended up going in very different places than I planned. And again, because my character, my protagonist, is precognitive, I had to figure out how to make sure that what I was doing would still come back and fit everything, all the teasers I'd given of the future. So yeah, best laid plans. And I did know it was going to be a series, but inevitably some part of the story has a tendency to run away with you and just pull you off in some place you never thought you were going to go.
That is what I love about writing fiction. That's also what's so hard about writing fiction. I have the attention span of a fruit fly. And so I write and I get distracted by something shiny over there and I write towards it and I'm like, gotta go back.
But it's good, sometimes, right? But those instincts, you gotta follow those instincts because, I have often found the things that I didn't plan originally in my conception of the story are the things that then I will really love about my books when I'm looking back on them once they're actually finished.
Any other questions out there? All right. Down front. He'll bring it to you.
Thank you. Hi, I was wondering, how would you care to share how you structure your writing in terms of, I'm assuming you have like jobs and oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Like, how do you schedule your writing and how do you put out 4 books in a year?
I don't recommend it. Yeah. Sure, I go for that. So I'm a teacher, and everyone writes in a different way, and I love teaching writing, and I always tell my students, I'm going to put you through different processes. I'm going to give you different pre-writing exercises, different revision exercises, and you're going to hate some of them, and they're going to feel really unnatural, and hopefully some of them you're going to say, oh, that felt right to me. But if it doesn't work for you, just try something else. So as I say, attention span of a fruit fly, I can write for about 45 minutes maximum, and then I have to do something else. I've never been able to write for more than 45 minutes, and sometimes my brain, it feels really full. I'm like, I gotta write, and like 10 minutes later, I'm like, empty. and then I move on about my day. So I get up in the morning, I usually go for a run or work out, and then I write, and then I'm good to go. And then I go off and teach and do the rest of my day, do it again the next morning. And I think that's why my novels in their early drafts are such a hot mess, because I've written in 45-minute increments, and then when I get enough of it, I go back and read all the way through, and that does take longer, and I leave that for a weekend or a vacation. And I'm like, oh yeah, no, this is like 20 different voices going in 30 different directions. but I just leave time for that. And I love revising. I love editing, almost as much as I like making it up in the first try. But that's what works for me. Don't recommend it. Probably a better way to do it. And yeah, so you just have to find what works for you.
Yeah, and I am exactly the opposite. I'm like, I sit down and I got to get the momentum going. It can take me like a good half hour, 40 minutes just to get myself there, and then I will write until you pry me off the computer, and like people are like, you need wine and food, come on. I do still have a part-time job. I'm not full-time on writing yet, so that is also what forces me away from the computer, but I have a really hard time doing my writing in short spurts. I want to sit down there and just put myself in the world and go for as long as I can get away with it.
And probably if we had more writers up here, it would be everything in
totally
between.
Different. Yeah, exactly.
Any other questions from the audience? All right. Well, thank you guys so much for coming out today. We really appreciate it.
It was lots of fun.
Both.